Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Fell Kingdoms podcast. To be honest with you, I don't even keep track of what number we're on because I've consistently done so many in a week. So we have this one today, and we have the next one on Thursday. So I really haven't even been keeping track of it because it's just way too much work, and I don't like work. So today we have a very special guest on the podcast. Today we have Mr. Kyle Alander. So we're going to be doing what we're going to be doing here is he's going to be making a case for metaphysical idealism, and he's also the I guess you are the person who started the YouTube channel Christian Idealism. So Kyle, can you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell us what you do, where you're from, where you're about.
Yeah, so my name's Kyle Alander. I created the Christian Idealism YouTube channel around a few years ago. At first, it was just kind of a bunch of hangouts that I did with people, and then I slowly was able to actually make formal videos, and now that's kind of what I do. And my main area of focus is just philosophy of mind, as well as probably philosophy of religion as well, because I do defend the existence of God. But my main focus is just defending idealism and that sort of metaphysical position. And so that's pretty much what I do for the most part.
Yeah. So before we actually get into the reasons for metaphysical idealism, can you first define what idealism is?
Right. So in order to understand idealism, I think it's best to understand the other positions as well. Not all of them. I'm not going to go over all of them, but there are three kind of general positions within philosophy of mind. So first of all, philosophy of mind is the study of what the nature of the mind is. And what is consciousness? I guess that's basically what it is. So the three views are, you have physicalism, which says that all is physical. So basically that consciousness is kind of like a byproduct of brain activity, or that consciousness is like an epiphenomena or kind of like dependent on brain activity. But then, the world that's out there is kind of just outside consciousness and it's all physical. So this is the position that is very popular, especially in our culture. Then you have dualism, which says that there are two fundamental substances. There's mind and matter. So basically under dualism, you would say that that the fundamental nature of reality is mind and matter in some sort of way, which means basically that consciousness cannot be reduced to brain activity, but rather there's consciousness and then there's something outside consciousness, which we call the physical world. And then the third position, which is called idealism, which is the position I hold to, basically says that all is mental, that basically that there is no reality outside of conscious experience. And that when we talk about a world that's out there, the world that's out there is still like mental in some way. So there's some philosophers like Bernardo Kastrup. He says that the world that's out there is independent of our minds, but that world is what's called transpersonal thoughts and feelings, right? And then the reason why it's called idealism is because it's about ideas. So when we talk about an idea, what we're talking about is just basically thoughts and basically the contents of consciousness. So basically all the contents of consciousness are kind of ideas, and then the idea, like the universe is an idea, or the universe is a thought, or that sort of thing. So that's basically idealism in a nutshell.
Yeah. So I guess it'll be a good time to just go into you making the case for metaphysical idealism.
All right. So the first, I'm going to start off with the weaker arguments. So the ones that I don't consider to be like the best arguments. And these have to do with the physics type of arguments. The reason why I consider those to be the weaker ones is because science only tells you what matter does. It doesn't tell you what matter is. So you have to be a little careful. So the first thing I want to point out here is probably the study of quantum mechanics. Now, quantum mechanics, obviously, it's a big field. I'm not a quantum physicist. However, I believe that you can make certain philosophical inferences from quantum mechanics. So if you look at what's called the Schrödinger equation, now, again, I'm not a physicist, so if I get this wrong, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, but basically what it says is that particles can be in what's called a superposition. So basically particles can be in two or more states at the same time. Now, if that's really the case, I mean, we don't experience the world in that sort of way, right? Like we see a classical world that's there, right? When we look at it, but according to quantum mechanics, that's not how reality works. How reality works is basically there's these superpositions of possible states, and that these superpositions don't actually exist in space-time at all. They're kind of just, physicists call it a Hilbert space or something like that. Mm-hmm. Now, you may be wondering, well, how is that relevant? Well, I'll get to that. So another thing is what's called the measurement problem. And the measurement problem is, how does a quantum system go from a superposition of possible states to something more classical like what we experience, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that the best solution to that problem would be consciousness. Now, there are a lot of objections to that idea. So the first objection is what's called decoherence. Basically, what decoherence says is that you don't need, basically, like when two particles interact with each other, they'll collapse each other, right? So you have like this environment of particles collapsing each other, and that'll explain why things just collapse on their own. Well, the problem with that hypothesis is, well, the particles themselves are in a superposition. In other words, the environment that we describe is still in a superposition. Decoherence doesn't tell you why you're looking at one state rather than the other. The only real thing that it explains is why we get a classical world. It doesn't explain how we actually get there. So basically, it's kind of like, it's only like halfway. It only gets like halfway there. Mm-hmm. If you want to see a good video, there's a video. It's called "Why Decoherence Doesn't Solve the Measurement Problem." You have to look it up on YouTube, and basically she explains like mathematically how it just doesn't get there, right? And you have a lot of physicists that say the same thing, that decoherence does not solve the measurement problem, because at some point you're going to have to apply the regular rules of quantum mechanics into play, right? Mm-hmm. And so, because the measurement problem cannot be solved through that sort of framework, I believe that you need something outside the quantum system in order to cause collapse. And that would basically what I would argue to be consciousness. That consciousness is the thing that will kind of cause collapse of the wave function. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, a lot of physicists don't hold that view. In fact, a lot of physicists, as far as I'm aware, take another position. There's a lot of other quantum mechanics interpretations. So you have Bohemian mechanics. There's also many worlds. Now, Bohemian mechanics, again, Bohemian mechanics, I would say, is compatible with idealism. But for the sake of this argument, I would say that the reason why I don't think it's the correct interpretation is there's a lot of problems with it. So number one, it's not compatible with special relativity. You're going to have these pilot waves that, again, if we're talking about locality, so another thing I think we should understand is what's called entanglement. So entanglement is basically when two particles will interact or some way, but then they'll share the same wave function. So basically, one particle will affect the other particle spontaneously, right? Mm-hmm. And then that happens regardless of how far they are. So if there is a pilot wave that's guiding these things, well, obviously it can't be in physical space-time, because that would violate special relativity. I mean, you have something that's going faster than the speed of light, right? Yeah. So you can't have. So even if there is a pilot wave kind of guiding the particles, that pilot wave would still have to be outside of space and time, right? Mm-hmm. So you have that sort of issue. And in the many worlds interpretation, I think that is, well, it's not. So from a scientific perspective, I think it's okay, right? There are a few, there's issues with probability and that it can't explain the Boltzmann constant, because it has really high. It requires really high heat capacities. If you want to understand, I'm not going to get into the technical work on that, but basically, what that shows is that in order for there to be the information content required for that many worlds to actually exist in the wave function, it would require a Boltzmann constant that is just not what we observe, right? Mm-hmm. And that's actually a new problem. So that problem is actually not talked about much in the literature, because it's a pretty new issue. But Another issue, I would say, is more philosophical, and basically that according to many worlds interpretation, you have to have like these multiple universes. So not just one universe, but you have to have like an infinite many universes that are constantly popping into existence every single time we like make a decision or make some sort of like any act that we do. There's like a parallel universe with you in it that that's doing something different, right? Because again, if we're applying Schrödinger equation, then every possibility has to be actual. So basically, every possibility in the wave function has to exist out there. Again, if we're gonna deny that there's a collapse of the wave function, we have to accept that these things are actually happening out there. And just from a philosophical perspective, that's just not a good hypothesis because it's not a simple hypothesis, right? If you have to posit an infinite amount of universes that are constantly being created every single time, like just from this conversation, there's probably like 20 or 30 different universes that popped into existence because I could have said something different or something else could have happened in the wave function. That's just not a simple hypothesis.
So I have a question. So
yeah.
In terms of so all of these different interpretations are trying to explain what's going on a quantum mechanical level,
right?
Is that right? Okay, I'll just
and there's a lot of them. So I would actually say that there's probably 5 interpretations that imply idealism. Right. So there are others like Copenhagen. You also have what's called quantum Darwinism, and I think those are more practical applications. So basically, and I understand why. I guess if you're going to take a pragmatic approach, you can just say, oh, well, there is no, philosophical implication to quantum mechanics. You can just kind of do the math and predict things, and that's pretty much it. But again, if we're going to make an argument for idealism, I think it's important to kind of, I guess, make some sort of argument for that, right? So I would say there are 5. So you have not quantum Darwinism. I mispronounced that. So there's what's called quantum Bayesianism. And then you also have the many minds interpretation. Then you have the relational interpretation. And then you have the orthodox interpretation. And then I think there's one, I can't remember the last one, but there's 5 interpretations that I think would imply idealism. And it's funny because the relational interpretation is actually one that Bernardo Kastrup argues for in his book. I think it was chapter 6, that he basically argues that the relational interpretation would imply idealism because if everything is relational, then that would include our consciousness. And so basically our consciousness, because it's relational to the world, then from our reference frame, we will collapse the wave function from our consciousness, essentially. Of course, there's also like a particle from their perspective, they could also collapse it. But again, if we're talking pure relations, then there is no absolute there's no absolute physical world out there. It's just kind of all relational in some way, right? So that would imply some sort of idealism, right? And then of course, the many minds interpretation, even though that would pretty much face the same problems as the many worlds, but because it's an idealistic version of the many worlds, and you basically say that there's like many versions of me that are kind of causing collapse to the wave function from their reference frames, right? So they live in different worlds. Again, it would still be idealistic because you have minds as kind of like the central aspect of that. There's, again, I would say that the best interpretations of quantum mechanics would imply some sort of idealism because if everything's if there is no if quantum mechanics is not describing something that's out there when we don't look at it, well, obviously that would imply some sort of idealism. And then finally, just kind of, I guess, make the argument stronger. So Donald Hoffman, in his book, argues that that basically there's something called, I can't remember, I think this is the name, I might get this wrong, but basically it's called Non-Contextual Realism. And according to non-contextual realism, there's a reality out there, regardless of whether or not you're looking at it. Okay, so basically that you can describe reality, or you can describe like the positions and momentum of particles independently of whether or not you're observing them. Okay, or whether or not you're what's called measuring them. Okay, And that hypothesis was falsified by the Cauchy-Spector theorem. And according to the Cauchy-Spector theorem, you cannot describe a quantum system independently of how you are to measure it. Now, of course, that doesn't completely, I guess, it doesn't refute the idea of a mind-independent reality, because again, you can kind of go to a many worlds hypothesis and simply say that from each person's reference frame, there's like an infinite amount of, different universes or worlds out there that are kind of going on. But again, I would just simply refer you back to the Boltzmann constant problem, as well as just that it's just not a simple hypothesis, philosophically speaking. So just from a philosophical perspective, it's much more simple to go with the idea that there is one reality, and then we kind of from our reference frame, we will collapse the wave function from our reference frame. And I think that's a simpler hypothesis than positing an infinite amount of universes that come into existence every single time you make a decision or something happens. So yeah,
cool. Yeah, so that is the, I guess, the
that's one of
the
that's one of the arguments, right?
Yeah,
so there's another argument from science that I like to use, and this is actually more recent, because you have to kind of understand, you have to kind of combine the ideas, right? So I would say this is a much stronger argument, because it's not relying on any real interpretation of quantum mechanics. So I think this helps a lot more to clarify. So the first half, now there's two parts to the argument, but I'll start with the first half and then go to the second half.
Right.
So the first half is about quantum gravity research. Now, I guess there's a few things we should kind of start with. So you have what's called the holographic principle. And this is a principle that was developed in recent years to kind of explain how black holes behave, right? And so what the holographic principle basically says is that when you throw something into a black hole, the information content of that object will basically spread out on the black hole. And the reason why this is helpful is because it's not, because we want to, physicists are really obsessed with trying to conserve the law of conservation. So the older models would basically say that when you throw something into a black hole, the information is destroyed. Okay. What this says is that it's not destroyed, rather it's kind of like spread out on the surface of the black hole. Okay. And what's weird about that is the way that you describe the information in a black hole is the same way that you would describe pretty much our entire universe. And so what that would basically mean is that the whole universe is kind of like, I guess some people think we are in a black hole, others think that it's just kind of like this holographic projection of a two-dimensional space. But regardless of which view you take, I mean, if we want to combine quantum mechanics and general relativity, the best way to do that is to understand black holes. And because of the holographic principle, we have this understanding of how the information content will kind of spread out on the black hole in this sort of holographic projection. So basically what happens is you throw something in there, and then it becomes like a two-dimensional information construct on the surface of the black hole, and then a three-dimensional, our three-dimensional reality is basically kind of an illusion, or kind of like a projection of some like two-dimensional information processing. Now that's what physicists talk about. Now, another related note on this is when they discovered this, they also discovered something else, which is called emergent space-time. And emergent space-time is actually, I think, so like there's a lot of different views on like quantum gravity. So you have, loop quantum gravity, you have string theory, there's a few, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's a few others. But basically what they all agree on, so like they have disagreements about like how exactly quantum gravity works, but what they all agree on is that space-time is emergent. So basically, space-time is not the fundamental nature of reality. That there's something deeper that's kind of there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, when you look at the research, what they're saying is that basically space and time are emergent from what's called entanglement. Now, I already mentioned entanglement earlier. Basically, entanglement, again, is the idea that all particles in the universe would kind of share the same wave function. But this entanglement, again, if we're talking about information traveling, they can't travel in space-time, right? Because it would violate special relativity. It can't go faster than the speed of light. So what happens? Well, you basically say that this information is outside of space-time. So it's kind of like it's what's beneath space-time, in other words, right?
So is it basically saying that this entanglement state between two particles,
It's what gives rise to space. Basically.
Yeah, so with this entanglement state between two particles, is it basically saying that like space-time isn't needed in order for those two particles?
Right, basically what they're saying is that you don't need space to describe how the particles are acting. In fact, this is what Sean Carroll made the same point, where you can describe a quantum state independently, so you don't have to reference space at all, right? So all you have to really do is describe that quantum state in terms of itself rather than having space as a description. And that's basically, it sounds weird, but that's basically how it is.
It sounds really weird. That's like, it sounds so like, because, we tend to be these type of people where we think in materialistic terms, where like to even say that entanglement, the act of entanglement, like you don't need space-time in order for entanglement to occur. That's like really trippy. Like this is the crazy.
Right.
Like I've literally heard of Christian idealism. I've been following your YouTube page for I think like a couple months now, and it's just completely like removed any sense of like reality. It's like I tend to think in materialistic ways, but then like this is what quantum mechanics and even like we'll get into the philosophy of mind and things like that. But it's just, and then it's telling us that space-time is not really fundamental. It's like that's so crazy and it's true.
No, yeah, right.
Yeah, go
and
ahead.
I think it's helpful to kind of understand the implications of that. Now, of course, it doesn't tell us about anything about the nature, whether or not the nature is mental or God or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it does show that space and time are not like what we experience as physical reality. That's not the ultimate reality that exists. There's something deeper to that, right?
Yeah.
So basically, like all physical objects that we experience that's not the fundamental nature of reality. And this is something that Donald Hoffman made in his book, that basically what physics is showing us is that what we see as the physical world, that is not the ultimate nature of reality. There's something much deeper to that, right? Now, that's one half. So the other half of the spectrum has to do with quantum cognition. Now, I guess to kind of understand quantum cognition is the field that basically studies how human behavior can be modeled in terms of quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. Now, right now within the literature, there's I guess they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. So they're basically saying, oh yes, the brain may act quantum mechanically, right? There may be some quantum processes or whatever, but it's not actually quantum mechanical, right? Mm-hmm. It's still classical, and that's just it's not really a good hypothesis. In fact, there was a recent study done by Matthew Fisher on rats, and I guess to kind of understand that experiment. So basically, you had lithium. I think it was lithium-6 and lithium-7. Now, chemically speaking, lithium-6 and 7 aren't really that much different. Mm-hmm. The only difference is they have like one extra electron or proton. I'm not sure. Basically, they only have one like additional molecule within the atom, right? Mm-hmm. So chemically speaking, there shouldn't be any difference. Now, what happened was when they gave lithium-6 and 7 to different rats, they saw different behavior that you would not expect if their behavior was caused by chemical processes. So if their behavior was caused by chemical processes, the prediction you would make from that is, well, there shouldn't be any differences in behavior with how the rats act.
Mm-hmm.
But what they found was that, I don't remember which group it was. I think it was either lithium-6 or lithium-7. One of the groups, what happened was when the group started acting out, so basically the rats started acting very strange. They would eat more, they would act up more, they would you could tell the difference. Like, you could tell from the different groups that they act very differently. Now, at first, the researchers were very, it was very mysterious why this was happening. But what they eventually found out was that there's different quantum states in lithium-6 and lithium-7. So basically, I think it's either lithium. I can't remember the exact thing, so I might get this wrong. Basically, I think it was either lithium-6. Basically, one of the chemicals had a different quantum state. In other words, it had a different. I think it was entanglement time, or had to do with something to do with nuclear physics. I'm not. I haven't. It's been a while since I've read the study. But basically, there's a different quantum state to one of those chemicals, and that's the explanation for why they were acting up. Is because what you're doing is you're giving them very similar chemicals, right? Lithium-6 and lithium-7.
Right.
But then at the other side, you're actually giving them very different quantum states. So basically, because of the lithium-6 and lithium-7, one of them has acted in a way that their quantum state is completely different than the other quantum state.
That's true.
And that's very interesting because that shows that there is quantum processes going on in these rats. And again, rats are very useful for figuring out how we work, how human brains work. Mm-hmm. And I think that human brains are also, like human thinking, human processing is pretty much all quantum mechanical. Now, another thing I guess I want to mention before I get to like the final conclusion of the argument is there was a paper. I can't remember. I can't remember the name, but there's a paper about what's that theory called? Okay, I'm not going to go there, but basically, integrated information theory. So again, I don't actually hold the integrated information theory. Yeah. But I'm sure Donald Hoffman would probably take this approach as well. Yeah. So according to integrated information theory, there's you could actually describe information in terms of entanglement. Okay, and information that kind of explains consciousness. So integrated information theory is a theory about consciousness. Mm-hmm. What basically says is that consciousness is basically entanglement. Well, if consciousness is entanglement, and if our minds kind of act quantum mechanically, in fact, they are quantum mechanical. So if our thought processes, if our thoughts are quantum mechanical, if we connect that back to where the space-time, well, hold on for a second. So you're telling me that space and time emerged from entanglement, right? Mm-hmm. So that basically quantum states do not exist in space-time. But then you go to quantum cognition, and it shows that quantum states are we have quantum states in the brain, basically. Like our thoughts our thoughts could probably be quantum mechanical in that sort of way. Mm. Well, you connect those two together. If space-time is emergent from entanglement, and if entanglement can be described as consciousness, well, you basically have consciousness giving rise to space-time itself.
Wow, that's great. Okay,
yeah.
So can you kind of sort of dispense all of that down just in a little bit more?
Yeah.
So starting from the integrated information state. Yeah, go ahead.
So again, because I actually hold probably to Donald Hoffman's idea, and that's basically conscious agents. But he goes a little different route because he's a pluralist. But if you were to take integrated information theory, basically consciousness is basically defined as just integrated information. Okay, mm-hmm. Right. And then there's actually a footnote in one of the papers that basically says that integrated information can be identical with entanglement. So how quantum mechanics is described, right? And then if you put that together with all the evidence from quantum biology with regards to how, our thoughts work and how human decision making occurs, and the fact that our brains are kind of quantum mechanical in some way, or at least our minds are quantum mechanical in some way, then you can basically conclude that the whole universe. Now, some people are like, okay, that's a non sequitur, right? Well, actually, there's another equation. It's called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, and basically that describes the entire wave function. And what they found was that this wave function is timeless. Basically, the universal wave function, what holds the entire universe together, that wave function is timeless, right? So you apply that to the whole universe. Well, basically what you show is that the whole universe is basically within this quantum system. But then if this quantum system, again, if entanglement is identified with consciousness, then you could basically show that that the whole universe is in consciousness because the whole universe is a quantum system. So,
that's really cool. Okay, so
yeah,
what is, if that's not the strongest argument for
it's not, no.
for metaphysical idealism, what would be the strongest arguments for metaphysical idealism?
Well, the strongest arguments would be philosophical. So let me see if I can get my hold on. Where's my note? Okay. So the first argument I would call where is it? Sorry, I have so many notes. I have to scroll through them real quick. Hold on.
You're good. I can wait. We can wait.
Okay. Why is it not showing up? I just had it up here. Hold on. I have to search for it because
no problem.
And what the hell?
Alrighty. Oh yeah, and I wanted to because I saw you. I saw that before you start. I wanted to ask you a question. Later on down the line, and you were talking about dream characters.
Oh yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because I have a question about it. But go ahead.
Okay, so the first argument, there's a popular argument on YouTube. It's called the Introspective Argument, and what I did is I made my own version of it. So it goes like this: Premise 1. Experience exists. Now that's obviously, you're experiencing something, right? So that's basically, I don't know why anybody would deny that, but so basically premise 1, experience exists. Premise 2, if there exists a physical world beyond experience, then there would be no observed correlations between states of experience and the brain. Premise 3, there are observed correlations between states of experience and the brain. Therefore, there does not exist a world beyond experience. In conclusion, therefore all is experience. Now, the only premise that I would have to defend would be premise 2, which basically, again, says if there exists a physical world beyond experience, then there would be no observed correlations between states of experience and the brain. So I think we should, in order to defend this premise, I think we should understand the distinction between consciousness and then something beyond consciousness. So subjective consciousness is a purely privately accessible thing and is examinable via introspection only. So basically, consciousness can only be accessed through your own personal thoughts. And then objective brain activity is a purely publicly accessible thing and is not examinable by introspection. So in other words, no matter how much you introspect into your brain, or basically no matter how much you introspect, you're never going to actually find an objective neuron going off. Okay. Now, assuming that there is a physical world for the sake of argument, then every single introspection and every single fMRI scan has ultimately gone through in history. We have only been able to infer someone's states of consciousness from the brain. So basically, we can only infer someone's states of consciousness in the brain. But consciousness itself can only be examined. So in other words, consciousness as it, basically what it's like to be you, can only be experienced through yourself, through introspection. Okay.
Right.
And so no matter how much you introspect, no matter how deep, you will never encounter one objective cell, one objective drip of water, or any objective neural activity. Such a thing would not even make sense, as it is a subjective examination of a subjective domain. So in other words, because it's all subjective, well, you can't examine something that's objective from something that's subjective, right?
Right.
And similarly, no matter how much you indirectly infer about my states of consciousness from brain activity, you will never actually find one subjective dream mountain, one subjective illusion, or one subjective wild imagination in the brain. Such a thing would not even make sense, as it is an objective examination of an objective domain. And so, if there is a physical world, then our internal worlds of consciousness are cut off from the exterior world of the physical, right? So there has to be some sort of like cutoff point where that our worlds of consciousness are kind of like beyond that physical world. Or I guess you can kind of reverse it. You can basically say that the physical world is beyond our consciousness, right? However, if the physical world is completely, so in other words, if it's completely cut off from the world, then there should be no influence between these two things at all. But there is. I mean, that's pretty much the whole idea. And so, therefore, there really can't be a physical world beyond experience. There can't be a world that's outside some sort of conscious experience, right?
So like for example, just correct me if I'm wrong. So in terms of recognize a correlation between, let's just say my consciousness and let's just say a brain state. If I'm thinking about a pink elephant, the only way that you could possibly know that is if I were to tell you, because it's a subjective experience. And
right. So, I can't go into your brain and like actually see a pink elephant. Right.
Right. And so it would you could probably like recognize a brain state that correlates with me thinking of a pink elephant, but you could never know that unless I had told you.
Right.
Okay.
Another thing I want to point out here is that idealism would actually predict correlation, because under idealism, everything is mental. So if the brain itself has mental ontology, then it should correlate with your own thoughts, which also have, mental ontology.
Yeah, it's good. Okay.
So another argument that I thought that is very helpful to kind of understand, I guess to kind of like understand the like what idealism actually says. It's called the causal closure argument for idealism. Now, if you look into the literature, typically the causal closure argument is an argument for physicalism. In fact, I would say that the causal closure argument for physicalism is probably the best argument for physicalism, right? I mean, I think it's a pretty good argument. Of course, I don't agree. There's one of the premises I don't agree with, but I think it's probably the best argument for physicalism. Right. And what you can do is you can basically reverse the argument and show that that you can actually use it to argue for idealism. So it goes like so. The argument. I have two different versions of the argument. I'm going to go with the first one. And so, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the argument from causal closure is perhaps the dominant argument for physicalism in the literature. Now, a parallel argument can be used for idealism. So premise one, the causal closure of the universe, that every event has a cause from an event that is the same in type, meaning events that interact must have the same substance and properties. So basically, premise one is basically just giving you causal closure. So basically, that two different substances cannot interact. That whatever interacts with another has to be one substance. That basically the whole universe is kind of like a closed system. So there's nothing really outside or beyond the universe. So that's causal closure. Premise two is the irreducibility of consciousness. That the mental is subjective and qualitative in type and cannot be reduced to or identified as an objective and quantifiable phenomena. The mental, in other words, the mental is basically its own category. So basically consciousness is its own category. And so premise 3, mental events cause physical events. For example, we normally think that events such as wanting to raise your arm, a mental event, can cause events such as raising your arm, right? But again, if everything's kind of closed in, everything's like this causal closure principle is true, and if consciousness is irreducible, then you can't really reduce one to the other. In conclusion, and therefore, physical events are mental in type, or more briefly, that idealism is true. For the thesis, if causal closure is true and the mental is irreducible, then causes of physical events, then the physical must itself be mental in type, and so the universe and everything that can be interact with the universe is also mental in type. So I guess the only principles you really have to accept is number 1, that the universe is causally closed, and then number 2, that consciousness is irreducible. It's basically that consciousness cannot be reduced or identified with brain activity or something like that.
So would you say, would you think that this argument is actually a good argument against dualism?
Oh, it is. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It is. So yeah, it is. It is an argument against dualism as well. Now, of course, what's weird though is how so a dualist would actually deny causal closure, right?
Okay, yeah.
So that's the real distinction. So what a physicalist has to do is they have to accept causal closure, but then deny the irreducibility of consciousness, and then the dualist will have to accept the irreducibility of consciousness, but then deny causal closure. What I'm doing is I'm basically accepting both those ideas, that the world is causally closed, but that also that consciousness is irreducible. So yeah.
Okay, well, because I heard that before. I actually heard I don't remember who it was, but I was discussing something with a skeptic, and
yeah,
he sort of brought up an argument like this, and it was like, and I wasn't an idealist then. I was a substance dualist, and I was like, well, yeah, that kind of does feel like a problem. Two different substances interacting with each other, that does kind of feel like a problem. So that's the reason why I sort of brought that up. But so basically, when it comes to idealism, so you're saying that causal closure?
Yeah, causal closure is true.
So you can accept that, and then you also accept the irreducibility of the mind.
Right, I do.
And on both sides in terms of substance dualism, and if you're
so like I'm trying to find another argument. It's like way deep in my notes, but so I would, like, for example, I would agree with dualists that consciousness is something that you cannot reduce to brain activity, right? So I agree with them there, but I don't agree with them when it comes to the causal closure. So I would actually agree with the physicalists in this case. I would go with their side and basically say, yes, I agree with you that the universe is causally closed. So we can agree to that with the physicalists. And then I go to a dualist and I say, I can agree with you there that that consciousness is irreducible. So then what I do is I take the two, I guess, best components of each theory, and then I combine them into idealism. And that's basically what it is. So.
Okay, so basically, they're both missing something in their metaphysical metaphysical framework, and then you're just taking the best of the best portions of the two and saying, "Yo, I agree with both of you guys," and
right.
This is basically how you solve the problem in both of your metaphysical framework.
That's weird. Yeah, hold on. That's weird. I can't find the. Oh, okay, perfect. So I agree with like I take the two best components of the theory, right? Because I think there are really good arguments for the causal closure of the universe, right? But I also think,
what would be one of them? One that you haven't because you said I
think it's just I guess it's more intuitive, but like I would say that if anything's going to interact with something else, there has to be like some sort of causal link between them, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
So there has to be like some sort of like shared property or something that like kind of unifies the two things and make them affect one another.
So why would the substance dualists, like, on what grounds would they deny? Is it casual closure?
Casual closure.
Okay.
Yeah.
On what basis would they deny that?
I guess they would say that like the universe, I guess, I don't know, because it really depends on how you define casual closure, right? So if you say that casual closure is true for space-time itself, well, obviously I don't agree with that, right? Because space and time itself, they're emergent phenomena, as I went over previously, right? So I wouldn't agree with casual closure in that sort of way, but I would agree with casual closure in the more broad sense, which is basically that all of reality is one casual reality. So basically, there's like this global casual reality, and there's different types of the same thing, but it's all still one like reality that kind of interacts with with itself. So, yeah.
So I think we're good on that one. So, do you have another argument? Well, another reason for this?
Yeah. So the last, I guess, I mean, there's also, I'm not going to go over them because they're pretty long to explain.
Yeah.
I guess to just mention a few, you have Royce's argument from the possibility of error. And then you also have Bradley's argument for absolute idealism. Now, another argument that I've been kind of working on is what I call the cumulative argument. Now, this isn't really an argument with premises. Rather, it's more of looking at idealism from like looking at them from a theoretic virtue perspective, right? So what are theoretic virtues? Well, theoretic virtues are simply like principles that you use to judge theories. So the first virtue is what I call simplicity. And basically, if everything is equal, then we should prefer the simple theory. Accept the theory which postulates the fewest number of unnecessary assumptions or less complex primitive entities, principles, and features. That is, that the theory should not be ad hoc. So I think that's a pretty basic principle to accept. That basically we should accept the theory that has the least amount of ad hoc assumptions to it. The second principle is explanatory scope, which is prefer the theory that makes best fit with the data. The best fit may involve some kind of trade-off between simplicity and direct fit. And then I think another two more important ideas is what's called explanatory power. So we should prefer the theory which explains more while avoiding problems. This means we should prefer the theory that leaves less unexplained as well as unify the wider domain of features. This includes the theory that invokes fewer primitive entities, features, and principles and can explain data better than the alternatives. And then finally, predictability, which is that we should prefer the theory that makes the most accurate predictions of future data, and that this theory has the most potential to explain and predict what we see in the world. So what I do is I basically compare each theory. So I compare idealism with the other views, which is physicalism, dualism, panpsychism, cosmopsychism. So I would say that idealism is a simple hypothesis, so it has simplicity because it only has one thing which grounds reality, which is the mental. And then I would also say that physicalism is also a simple hypothesis because you're positing only one substance, which is the physical, and then matter, or what you call the physical, would basically exist outside of conscious experience. So I would say those are simple. And then dualism, I would not say is simple because you're positing two fundamental substances. So due to it being less simple, then idealism and physicalism, I would say, is more simple than dualism. And then panpsychism and cosmopsychism, I would say, is also simple as well in some certain respects. Now, and then if you look at, so that's just one of them. Then you go to explanatory scope, and I would say that that idealism can explain experience. So it has the resources to explain why we experience things, of course, because that's the only thing it needs to posit, right? Yeah. I mean, and in physicalism, I would say it can explain experience in principle, but that it has issues with how consciousness can kind of emerge from something that's not conscious. So basically, it can pass explanatory scope, but only with the cost of its simplicity. So in other words, physicalism cannot have explanatory scope without getting rid of its simplicity. And of course, I would say the other views, I think the rest of them would also pass explanatory scope. And then now, I think the more important aspect has to do with explanatory power, right? So under idealism, it has consciousness can explain all of reality. It leaves very little unexplained. And I guess we can get the dream characters to kind of explain that aspect as well. But given the argument from causal closure and the irreducibility of consciousness, then it can explain the physical world and our experience. And it does not face conceptual problems like alternatives. And so when it comes to explanatory power, I would say that pretty much all the other alternatives would have some type of problem. So physicalism cannot explain the existence of our experiences due to the hard problem of consciousness. And then, of course, physicalist theories lack simplicity and are fallacious. And in dualism, cannot explain the interaction problem. Panpsychism cannot explain the combination problem, which is how you can get micro experiences to form a macro experience. And then cosmopsychism cannot explain how a micro subject can fracture into many micro subjects. And then finally, predictability is that experience and consciousness is entailed by hypothesis. And so it predicts consciousness by a factor of 1, right? And then, of course, it accepts causal closure as well. And then I would say for physicalism, I would say it's right about causal closure, but then it's wrong about the irreducibility of consciousness. And in dualism, I would say that it predicts the irreducibility of consciousness correctly, but then it gets causal closure wrong. Now, I guess to kind of summarize the overview of all this. So idealism is simple and explains experience, has explanatory power, and it faces no conceptual problems. And it also has predictability in terms of explaining other phenomena like the causal closure of reality. So when we take one example, and I like to use this because this is a common objection to idealism that you hear. So basically, they'll say like, oh, well, I can take a rock and I'll just throw it down on my foot, right? And it's like, oh, well, therefore there is nothing outside, well, that there is a reality outside of experience. Well, the problem is that concreteness itself is a qualitative experience. Since it is the life world, again, that's basically what experience is. And then like other, I guess, alternatives would require properties that are not experienced through mental activity. And so physicalism, panpsychism, cosmopsychism, and dualism all require the additional assumption of a world outside of concreteness and experience. Now, one might object, of course, that the alternatives must make those assumptions to explain the world. However, any robust ontology must entail something beyond our awareness and direct experience, since we need to explain, again, why we all live in the same world and why we cannot change its natural laws. However, we know that consciousness is the sole undeniable ontological class and is the primacy of existence. So while the alternatives propose a fundamental new ontological class beyond consciousness, idealism just simply expands the boundaries of consciousness without adding this new ontological category. And so therefore, given the reasons that matter is an abstraction from mind, well, that's basically the conclusion, is that matter is an abstraction from mind. Because, again, if we're talking about matter, we have to posit something that's outside consciousness. And so I guess you could say, to kind of wrap up here, that the existence of matter, or I guess any world outside consciousness, is not an empirical fact. Rather, it is the extra assumption in the explanatory model of the non-idealist positions. And so when we apply Occam's razor, and since idealism doesn't require this extra assumption of this world outside consciousness, then idealism has a simpler explanatory model and therefore should be preferred over alternative ontologies. And so in terms of theoretical virtues, the non-idealist views have a higher cost since they add the abstraction of matter. idealism has an advantage over the alternative ontologies by being simpler and still retaining its explanatory and predictive power. And thus, idealism is the best ontological and metaphysical view of the mind and reality. So again, that's a pretty, it's not an argument per se, but it's more of like making the point that when you apply these theoretic virtues to these metaphysical positions, I think idealism wins on every account. It has the explanatory power. It's simple. There's no need because there's no need to add something beyond consciousness, right? Then it's the best theory, I think. So.
Yeah. So, well, now that we're in idealism, can you talk about the whole dream character scenario?
Right. So this is something that I've had to really think about, and I've also talked to other idealists about it as well. And the reason is because I think that the best objection to idealism has to do with how a macro subject, like universal consciousness in this case, can kind of fracture into these smaller conscious minds like us, right? And so under idealism, again, if we think in the terms of idealism, you could essentially say that the whole universe is kind of like a dream. Because when you think about dreams, I mean, dreams are experienced, right? But they're experienced within the mind, right? Like when you have it, when you're sleeping or something, right? So that's basically what idealism says, that reality is a dream. Now, it's not your dream, it's not my dream, but rather it's universal consciousness. So basically there's this universal consciousness that exists, beyond us, right? And then it created the world that we experience. And this world is basically a dream world, because if everything's mental, well, we have to start talking in those terms. We can't really talk about in terms of a physical reality that's like beyond consciousness. Rather, we have to talk about reality in terms of consciousness. And so you basically have to talk about reality as if it were a dream, because that's what dreams are, right? So dream characters, the reason why I think those are important to understand is because I think dream characters can help us understand how we ourselves were created from this universal mind. And so there's actually a lot of studies done on this. And there's this researcher, his name is Tolley, and what he showed from his research is that these dream characters were able to like do complex tasks, like mathematics, or and it really depends, because not all dream characters are. Most of them are not very smart, but for the ones that are smart, they act as if they're conscious, right? And there's a lot of dream therapists that recommend that you treat them as if they're conscious. And I believe that what dream characters essentially are is they're basically submerged into our minds. So when we have a dream, then those dream characters are submerged into our experience, and they essentially are their own person in some sort of way. Like they're an extension of us. Like they're really a part of us in some sort of sense. But they also, because they're a part of us, because they're kind of submerged into that dream, then they would essentially be that sort of I guess you can call it a micro mind, or basically a dream character, because they have limited knowledge, but of course that knowledge came from us, right?
Like I guess when it comes to this, like I get how you would translate that. Like this, it probably does give us a better understanding into like how I guess you would call it the primary consciousness. Then it I don't want to say breaks down, but it then translates over into these multiple other characters.
I'm trying to find my notes on this, because my friend was able to. Okay, here it is.
Yeah.
Oh wait. Okay. So yeah, I think it can really explain how persons are created, right? Because this is something that like a lot of philosophers are puzzled by, right? So if you're a physicalist, you would say that consciousness is emergent from the brain, right?
Right.
Now, of course, I don't accept emergence, but I think there's a different term that the idealists can use in what's called submergence, right? So something that is submergent is something where you get from a whole to parts. So we can deny so an idealist like myself, I would deny the emergence of consciousness, but I could affirm what's called submergent consciousness. And so dream characters would actually just basically be different aspects of submergent consciousness. So in other words, I guess like a dream character's consciousness would be a submergent from my perspective.
So how would that? Because I like obviously you're saying this in order to get a better understanding how persons are created, right?
Right, and my view is basically is that persons are created from submergence, right?
So like I'm kind of because I'm on board with you.
Yeah.
But it's sort of weird in my opinion because could be how like I think the issue with me, and I don't necessarily think it's an issue with me per se. I think it's more so of an issue with particular if you're going to accept idealism and you would accept like this I guess this thinking. I don't see how I'm kind of at a loss in terms of like what do you do with evil? What do you do and with that, like what do you do if you believe in like eternal damnation? I don't know if you do or not. But if you did, then like how does that bold with these characters being submergent within the primary consciousness? Because it seems like
right
for this, I can't just say God because we know what we're talking about. So
yeah, right.
So God seems to me with everything is within God's consciousness, right?
Right.
Or within the consciousness. God is consciousness. And so it seems a little wonky to me to say that God will allow for something like eternal damnation to persist and to exist eternally.
Right. So I should make a, I guess, distinction,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I don't hold to eternal damnation, but under my position, I would say that those that are eternally damned are basically there because they want to be, like people that are in hell are there because they want to be in hell, right?
Mm.
Now, of course, even then, like you're right to point out that they still depend on God's existence. So in other words, they can't exist without God, right? Mm-hmm. So there's still like an ontological relationship that between like these persons and God, mm-hmm. right? But I think hell, from my perspective, is more of a relational thing. So the reason why people are in hell is because they don't want to be with God, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's just what they choose to do. Now, of course, they still depend on God for their existence, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's what they're dream characters. But at that point, I would say that those that are in hell are basically there again just because they want to be, and they just don't want to be around God. Now, whether or not God will annihilate them or keep them there forever, I don't know. But
right, because it seems to me like, in terms of eternal damnation, like it seems to me that annihilation would bode better on this.
It would, yeah.
Because now you don't have evil persisting, in consciousness. So you have basically God just like when we wake up, right, and we're dreaming, and you like the dream characters are sort of annihilated while we're awake, while when you're awake. So it sort of makes you can sort of make that distinction, because like I was watching your interview with Josh Rasmussen. Yeah. And cool guy. But
even he was confused as well about this.
And the thing is just like, because I am a universalist. I'm a Christian universalist, but
Hey, me too.
it just feels for me. It just felt like it's sort of problematic to take an idealist an idealist way of understanding reality and then
Right.
believing that.
Well, actually, so I guess I should say that God would not stop experience. So because Kastrup makes this point as well. Now he doesn't call it God, but what he does say is that whatever this universal consciousness is, it doesn't have extrinsic experiences. So like we have extrinsic experiences because there's a world outside of us.
Yeah.
But from God's perspective, it's all within himself. So basically what God's doing is basically God is always introspecting. That's basically what the universe is. That the universe is the imagination, or it is the imagination of God. Right. It's the dream of God. So God would not be, he wouldn't stop he wouldn't stop dreaming. So I know some people will be like, oh, well, doesn't that imply, in a total universe or something like that? Well, not necessarily, because even then, like we don't know if God is timeless. So if God is a timeless being, then creation, I think, could be finite, right? There could be a time in which God's not introspecting. In that case, if he's not introspecting, then it would just kind of be him just kind of there. But yeah, that's why, like, I think if you're going to take a universalist perspective, then yeah, God would never stop dreaming, because that's what reality is. So if God just one day has decided, oh, I'm just, I'm not going to dream anymore, well, that's basically a way to annihilate all of reality. And
I mean, because I think, and I know this, like, we're getting into theology, but the only reason why I brought it up is because of like this whole characters in a dream thing. Right. So for me, it was just like I sort of have this metaphysics that says that, and it's obviously it's Eastern Orthodox people believe it, but they believe in the finite nature, finitism of sin, of evil. And Origin, he actually says it. He says that because sin is finite, it has to have a dying out date. Like, it can't exist forever. And so if you are to, and the only reason why that is because God is good in his nature, and so evil doesn't come forth from God, or at least God doesn't will evil to exist, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah.
So for him, he would say, well, because God is the ultimate end of all things, because God wills only the good, then whatever happens at the end of whatever this is, at the end of this age, it has to be good, and sin by its very nature has to be eradicated. And so the point is that if this is the reason why I'm so open to annihilationism, because annihilationism actually deals with the problem of if God is the ultimate end of creation, which is goodness, then it doesn't make any sense to say that people are still going to persist in sin when sin is finite, or to persist in sin forever. And so for me, it was just like, well, it makes more sense to say either God, those particular people who are going to be persistent in their sin, God would just simply annihilate them out of existence.
Right. And I agree with you. I think if you were to take that view that sin can't last forever, then yeah, I think the only two options is either annihilationism or universalism. So
it's cool. I love all of this because it sort of already encapsulates everything that I already know, that I already believe. And so idealism, to me at least, in terms of my religious metaphysics and how I understand sin, how I understand God's goodness, idealism just basically makes it a lot more coherent in a sense, because now we don't have, like, now we have God being consciousness itself, God being reality itself. And so, it also talks, 1 Corinthians 15:22, I think. At the very
Yeah.
end of it says God will be all in all. So it's like,
Yeah. So actually, it's funny that you mentioned that because I actually have a metaphysical model of explaining how spin works within an idealist framework. If you want to see those videos, it's called it's in my Quantum Hermeticism series, and it's video number 8 and 16. So
yeah, I would definitely check it out. It's a very interesting topic. So
right.
yeah, so we went to it's been about a good hour or so. So
Right.
thank you for coming on. Do you have anything else to add before we
No,
end?
I mean, I'm going to be working on my YouTube videos. I'm almost at 1,000 subscribers, so subscribe. I'll probably be doing a live Q&A soon because I'm almost at 1,000. So once I reach that number, I'm going to do a Q&A for my channel. But yeah, other than that, I'm going to be doing that, and then I'm also going to be continuing to work on my foundation theory series, and that's based off that's actually based off the work of Josh Rasmussen. So I'm glad that he was able. He reviewed the scripts and stuff, so it's all good to go. But yeah.
It's cool. It's really cool. I had Josh on, he was on the pod. He and his wife was on the podcast maybe 2 months, not even a month ago. So it's
Yeah.
cool. He's really cool. He and his wife too. And I kind of felt like that was an honor because that was the first time that both he and his wife actually did actually did a live stream together, or a podcast or whatever this is together. So I was very honored. So it's cool that he reviewed it for you, and I can't wait to see it.
Yeah.
Yep. So guys, thank you. This is Kyle Alander. Sorry.
Yeah.
He runs the YouTube channel Christian Idealism. You should go check it out because he's a very smart guy. And if you don't know a lot about idealism, you should go to his page and check it out. There's over 50 videos. There's probably over that, right? Yeah. So go to his channel, subscribe to him, watch. Make sure you follow what he's posting. Make sure you like and subscribe on this page. I know you also have a Facebook page, right?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, like and subscribe on his Facebook page. Help him, support him. He's doing really good stuff in the Christian apologetics intellectual part of YouTube and of social media. So make sure you follow him, hit him up on YouTube and Facebook. And I think that's it. This is the Fellow Kingdoms YouTube podcast. Make sure you like and subscribe to the actual YouTube page. We only have 55, 56 subscribers because it's a fairly new page. So make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you let us know of any other people that you want us to bring on. Kyle was actually brought up by another person, and so that's when I asked him to be on the show. So let us know, guys. This is the Fellow Kingdoms podcast on YouTube. It's also going to be in audio form on SoundCloud. Thank you, guys. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Kyle.
Yep.